Okay, so to get started today, I want you to just completely erase your mental image of a witch trial.
Mm-hmm.
Forget the green skin, forget the pointed hats, and honestly, for a moment, let's even forget Salem.
Right. That's the big one everyone defaults to, but this is a whole different world.
It's a completely different world. Instead, I want you to imagine you are standing at the literal edge of the inhabited world. You're in the Arctic Circle. You're on this frozen, jagged coastline in the far, far north of Norway.
And it's dark.
It is the middle of winter, which means the sun has not risen for weeks, and it will not rise for weeks to come. It's this absolute crushing, disorienting kind of darkness.
The only light is coming from the stars, maybe the moon if you're lucky, and the reflection off the snow and ice.
Exactly. And if you look at a very specific, long wooden building that's right there on the water's edge, 91 small lights. They're burning in 91 windows.
It's an incredibly haunting image.
Mm.
And when you realize what you're actually looking at, it stops being just, atmospheric and becomes something physically heavy. You feel it. Those lights aren't decorative. They're not there for warmth. Not really.
Right, because each one of those 91 lights, it represents a specific human being who was burned to death on the frozen ground just outside that building. We are talking today about the Vardø witch trials.
Which is a topic that I think, despite its sheer scale and its brutality, has largely slipped through the cracks of popular history.
It really has.
We all know the American narrative of Salem. We know the broad strokes of the big European inquisitions, but Vardø it's distinct. It's an outlier in almost every sense of the word.
It is an outlier. The geography, the intensity, the sheer duration of the trauma. And that's really what we're doing today. We are taking a deep dive into what happened in this tiny, tiny fishing village in the 17th century. And we have a massive stack of sources here. We've got court transcripts, historical climatology reports, which are fascinating, legal analysis, even architectural studies of the modern memorial that now stands there. But the mission today, it isn't just to recount the horror.
No, absolutely not. I think the ghost story approach, it really does a disservice to the victims. It turns them into props.
Exactly. We want to understand the psychology of a community that feels like it has no way out. We want to analyze how grief, specifically a terrible, sudden collective grief, can metabolize into accusation. And we need to look at the numbers because the numbers themselves are staggering.
They really are. To understand the scale, you have to look at the proportion. Vardø wasn't a metropolis. It was a community of roughly 3,000 people.
And they were scattered over a huge area.
A massive area, about 18,000 square miles. So in that incredibly sparse population, 140 people were put on formal trial for witchcraft.
140.
And of those, 91 were condemned to death.
I was trying to do the math on that earlier, just trying to contextualize it. If you scale that number up to a modern city, say London or New York, the death toll wouldn't be in the dozens. It would be a genocide.
It would be tens of thousands of people. It's almost unthinkable. And unlike Salem, which, for all its intensity, burned itself out in a matter of months.
Right. A terrible but short fever.
Exactly. This went on for 70 years, from roughly 1621 to 1695. It was a generational trauma. Children grew up watching their parents burn, only to be accused themselves 20 years later.
So we're going to unpack this slowly. We're going to look at the geography of fear, which is so critical. We're going to look at the specific storm that triggered the panic. We'll get into the heartbreaking story of a 12-year-old girl named Marion and this colonial project against the indigenous Sami people that was hiding in plain sight the whole time.
It's a heavy topic, and the sources, they really don't pull any punches. But it's necessary. I think it shows us the mechanism of what happens when fear takes the wheel of a legal system.
Okay, so let's start where the people lived. We absolutely need to set the scene because in this story, the landscape itself is almost the primary antagonist.
It is the defining factor.
Yeah.
You absolutely cannot understand the Vardø trials without understanding where Vardø is. It sits at 70 degrees north latitude. It's the absolute northeastern tip of Norway.
To put that in perspective for you, one of the sources pointed out something that just blew my mind. Vardø is further east than Istanbul.
Yeah.
It's further east than Cairo.
Right. It completely messes with your mental map of Western Europe. If you go any further east from Vardø, you're in Russia. The border is right there. If you go north, there is nothing. It is just the Barents Sea and ice until you hit the North Pole.
So we're talking about extreme isolation.
The most extreme. And the weather that comes with that. Well, that's the other part of the equation.
I mean, we complain about seasonal depression when it rains for a week, but this is a whole other level. We're talking about the polar night.
And this is so crucial to the psychology of what's about to unfold. For 2 months, from late November to late January, the sun never rises.
Never.
Not even a little peek over the horizon. It is total darkness. And we are not talking about like a gloomy afternoon where you need to turn a light on. We are talking about a darkness so complete, so disorienting, that the sources say you could lose your sense of direction just walking 30 feet to your neighbor's house.
That sets a psychological stage, doesn't it? When you are deprived of light for that long, the brain, it must start to do strange things.
Profoundly. I mean, darkness triggers fear biologically. That's just hardwired into us. But it also triggers imagination. When you can't see what's out there, your mind fills in the blanks. And it's not always with friendly things.
No.
And then there's the physical brutality of it. Temperatures dropping to -30, winds that are strong enough to knock a grown man off his feet. You are living in an environment that is, frankly, constantly trying to kill you.
And then, just to destabilize you even more, summer comes around and the sun never sets.
The midnight sun. 2 months of constant pale gold light. 24 hours a day. Time loses its meaning. People can't sleep properly. You're in this state of perpetual exhaustion, being overstimulated.
So you have a population that's perpetually either in sensory deprivation during the winter or sensory overload in the summer.
It's disorienting. It frays the nerves. There's no equilibrium.
But despite all of that, people lived there. They chose to live there. So why? What was the draw?
One word. Cod. Arctic cod. It was an incredibly prosperous fishing community, believe it or not. The ocean there was just teeming with life. The scree, the wandering cod, they come down for the Barents Sea to spawn in this massive annual migration.
So the entire economy, the entire reason for being there was built on the sea.
Entirely. And that, in turn, dictated the social structure. It created this very strict division of labor. The men went out in these small, open, wooden boats, sometimes for days at a time, to catch the fish. It was dangerous, grueling work.
And the women?
The women stayed on land. They were the ones managing the homes, the children, and these massive wooden racks for drying the fish. The whole landscape was covered in them. So they were managing the household and the core of the local industry.
It sounds like a hard life, but a functional one, a delicately balanced system.
It was functional. It was precarious, but it worked until Christmas Eve, 1617.
This is the catalyst, the moment the timeline just fractures.
This is it. December 24th, 1617. By all accounts in the historical record, it started out as a normal day. The weather looked manageable, for the Arctic. 40 men in 10 boats went out to fish.
Which was common practice, right? It wasn't unusual for them to be fishing on Christmas Eve.
Oh, very common. Families needed the income and the cod were running. You don't ignore the harvest just because it's a holiday. Your survival depends on it. But then the sources describe something terrifying happening. Witnesses on the shore said the sea and the sky suddenly became one.
One of the accounts I read, and it's such a chilling phrase, said it was as if the storm was loosened from a bag.
That phrase gives me chills every single time I read it. Loosened from a bag. Just think about what that implies.
It's not natural.
It's not natural. A natural storm builds. You see the clouds gather, the pressure drops, the wind picks up. It's a process. This was instantaneous. 1 minute, it's calm enough to fish. The next, the wind is screaming and the water is a wall of white.
It implies intent. It implies that someone or something opened the bag.
Exactly. And in that single violent moment, all 10 boats were lost.
All of them. Not one made it back.
Every single one. 40 men, gone in an instant.
We have to just pause and think about what that means for a village of this size. It's not just a tragedy, it's
a demographic collapse.
Yeah.
The source material calls it an amputation, and I think that's the perfect word for it. The ratio of women to men shifted overnight to this desperate imbalance. You had a village suddenly populated largely by widows and fatherless children.
The entire male workforce for that generation just wiped out.
Gone. The breadwinners were gone. The labor force was gone. Financially, it must have been ruinous.
Completely. But the financial ruin, I imagine that was secondary to the spiritual crisis that followed.
It was. You have to remember, these people lived in a world where God was the ultimate micromanager. God controlled the weather. God sent the fish. God sent the calm seas. So when a storm like this strikes so sudden, so targeted, killing 40 men on a holy day like Christmas Eve, the question isn't just what happened.
The question is, why us?
Exactly. Why us? Why now? What did we do to deserve this?
And this is where that grief starts to turn into something so much more dangerous. Because if God did it, you just have to suffer. You have to accept it as a test of faith. But if it wasn't God...
Right. And they couldn't accept that it was just a random natural disaster. The storm was too weird, it was too fast, it was too cruel. So the conclusion the village reached, gradually, and then all at once, was that it wasn't natural at all.
Meaning someone summoned it.
Someone used dark power to murder those men. And that is the moment the switch flips. Grief is converted into accusation. They started looking for the witch who loosened the bag.
It's tragic because it's a coping mechanism, isn't it, in a weird way?
It is.
If a witch did it, then the world still makes sense. There's a bad guy, there's someone you can punish, and maybe that stops it from happening again.
Precisely. If it's just the weather, you're helpless. You're just flesh waiting to freeze. But if it's a witch, you have agency. You could do something about it. You can find them, you can try them, and you can burn them. It restores a sense of control, even if that control is a horrific, bloody illusion.
But usually in a situation like this, you'd hope there would be some voice of reason, some authority figure to step in and say, hey, storms happen in the Arctic. Let's not start killing our neighbors. Why didn't that happen in Vardø?
That brings us to what our sources call the perfect storm of authority, or maybe the perfect vacuum of authority. You have to look at the political structure of the time. Vardø was the most remote settlement in the entire Danish-Norwegian kingdom.
So there are no legal institutions nearby, no appeals court.
None. The nearest major city was weeks of travel away, and that's if the weather was good. There was no one to appeal to.
So there's no oversight at all.
Zero oversight. The central authority in Copenhagen only cared about two things from Vardø: taxes and obedience. And to make it worse, King Christian V was actually quite obsessed with witchcraft himself.
Oh, great.
He wrote about it, he legislated against it. So the tone from the very top was, witches are real and they are enemies of the state.
And the people who were actually running the show locally, the bailiffs, the lensmans, they weren't locals, were they?
No, and that's a crucial detail. The local power was held by officials from Scotland, Germany, and Denmark. These were career bureaucrats, essentially, posted to the edge of the world, and they came from countries that already had massive, established witch-hunting traditions.
So they brought their baggage with them.
They brought their baggage and they brought their theology. There was this very specific belief held by religious scholars at the time, the evil north theology.
Wait, evil north? You mean like the literal compass direction?
Literally the compass direction,
yeah.
yes. Based on interpretations of the book of Jeremiah, where it says, out of the north an evil shall break forth. There was a genuine theological position that the north was the gateway to demonic influence. They believed that people living in frozen regions were physically and spiritually closer to the devil's domain, that the cold and the dark made them more susceptible to temptation.
So these foreign officials, they show up in Vardø. It's freezing. It's dark for months on end. The locals are speaking a dialect they can barely understand, and they're just thinking, yep, this is definitely where Satan lives.
Exactly. They were primed to see witchcraft everywhere. They were terrified of the environment, and they projected that terror onto the people living in it. So when the storm of 1617 hits, and the locals start whispering about curses and magic,
The officials don't say calm down.
they say, we knew it. We have to purge this place.
And to make matters even worse, the law actually changed right around this time, didn't it?
Yes, the 1620 sorcery law was a new piece of legislation updated just 3 years after the storm. It was specifically designed to make prosecution easier.
How so?
It removed the need to prove that the magic caused actual physical harm, what they called maleficium. Before, you had to prove that someone's curse made your cow sick. Under the new law, simply making a pact with the devil, even if you didn't do anything with that power, was a capital offense. It was enough for execution.
So you have a grieving, terrified population. You have paranoid foreign officials who believe they're living at the gates of hell. You have a brand new, strict law that makes it easy to convict. And you have absolutely no one watching.
The machinery was primed and ready to grind.
Let's talk about that machinery. How did an accusation actually work? Because the sources say it wasn't just authorities picking people at random from a list.
No, it was much more intimate and, in a way, much more insidious than that. The accusations almost always came from neighbors, from friends, sometimes even from family.
The source mentioned a woman being accused because she lent someone salt. Can you explain that?
Yes. This is where the tragedy becomes so personal and so petty. In a small, isolated village, everyone is dependent on everyone else. You have to borrow things, you have to trade favors, but that also means everyone has friction.
Of course.
Maybe you didn't return a pot on time. Maybe your sheep grazed on my land 10 years ago. These tiny, decades-old grievances suddenly became lethal. The woman who lent you salt was later accused of summoning storms because, well, the accuser could say, she had access to my house, she saw my fishing gear, she must have cursed it.
So intimate knowledge was weaponized.
Completely. The man who mended your nets a year earlier could testify that he saw you dancing with the devil on a hill. It was a way to settle old scores under the cover of religious piety.
That's the terrifying part. In a small town, everyone knows everyone's business, everyone's secrets. If you have a grudge against someone, suddenly that grudge can become a death sentence.
And once you were accused, that's when you face the water test.
This is, I've heard of this before, but reading the specific details in our deep dive material was harrowing. This wasn't just some folk test. This was a formal legal procedure.
It was the primary method for determining guilt in Finnmark. About a third of the trials used it. And the logic, if you could even call it that, was purely theological.
Right.
Water is a pure element. It's used in baptism. It washes away sin. So the belief was that if a person is in league with the devil, if they're fundamentally impure, the pure element of water will physically reject them.
So if you float, you're guilty. The water won't take you.
Correct. If you sink, the water accepts you. You're innocent.
But if you sink in the Arctic Ocean,
you drown. Or, best case scenario, they manage to haul you out and you die of hypothermia within minutes. The water's freezing. It causes immediate shock, cardiac arrest. It's a death sentence either way.
So it's the impossible choice. Sink and die innocent or float and die guilty.
And here's the kicker, the cruel scientific irony of it all. Human bodies, especially women, wearing the multiple layers of wool clothing that were common in the 17th century Arctic, generally float in salt water.
Air gets trapped in the skirts?
The air gets trapped, the wool holds it, so almost everyone floated. It was almost a physical certainty.
Which the court then took as irrefutable proof of witchcraft.
Right. They'd point and say, look, the sea refuses her. She is guilty. So they would haul these women out of the freezing sea, hypothermic, terrified, traumatized, probably half drowned, and then immediately begin the interrogation to demand a confession.
And of course, at that point, they confessed.
Of course they did. They were broken. Between the torture, and let's be clear, they used thumb screws, the rack, and other horrific devices, the fear, the cold, the sheer physical and mental pain, they would say whatever the inquisitors wanted to hear just to make it stop.
And the things they confess to, they get really specific, don't they? They aren't just saying, yes, I am a witch. They are telling these elaborate stories.
They do. And the stories are wild. But they're also oddly consistent, which is a key clue. They confess to flying, but in the shapes of cats and dogs and sea monsters. They confess to gatherings on the summit of the mountain Domen, which is just outside the town. They confess to drinking beer with the devil.
Beer?
Yes, specifically beer. And the devil often appeared in the form of a black dog. They confess to tying knots in ropes to summon winds, which goes back to the loosen from a bag idea.
Why were the stories so consistent?
Because the inquisitors were asking leading questions. It wasn't what happened. It was, did you drink beer with the devil? Was the devil a black dog? Did you meet on Domen Mountain?
And if you're in agony and you want the pain to stop, you just say, yes, absolutely, I love beer with the devil. He was a lovely dog.
Exactly. It's a terrifying feedback loop.
Yeah.
The victims feed the inquisitors the story they want to hear, which convinces the inquisitors that this vast conspiracy is real, which makes them torture the next person even harder to get more names.
And then, after the confession, the execution.
The end of the line. And again, this is where Vardø stands out in its brutality. In much of continental Europe, executioners would often strangle the condemned before burning them. It was seen as a form of mercy.
Right.
In Vardø, the records indicate that was rare. They were often burned alive at the stake.
And the setting. The execution ground itself was visible from the prison cells in the fortress.
It was right there. It was a deliberate act of psychological torture for those still waiting their turn.
You could look out the window of the fortress and see your neighbor burning. You could smell the smoke. You could hear the screams, knowing that you were next on the list.
This brings us to a specific wave of trials that I think is the most heartbreaking part of this entire story. The frenzy of 1662 and 1663. Because this is where the dynamic shifts. It stops being just adults accusing other adults.
This is where the children get involved. And this is where we meet Marian Allwater.
Marian was 12 years old. 12. Just a child. And her backstory is just devastating. She had already watched her mother be arrested, tried, and burned as a witch. Then she had watched her aunt meet the same fate.
So she's an orphan, essentially created by these very same trials.
She is an orphan of the trials. And because she was the child of convicted witches, the court decided she was useful. They brought her in for interrogation because they thought she knew things. They operated on the assumption that the evil was hereditary.
A 12-year-old girl, alone in a fortress, surrounded by the same men who had killed her mother.
A deeply traumatized 12-year-old girl. And she gave them a confession that was incredibly vivid and incredibly detailed. She described visiting hell. She described seeing a great water in a black valley that would boil whenever Satan blew in a horn. She talked about balls where everyone played red violins.
Where does a kid in a tiny Arctic fishing village get that kind of imagery? That doesn't sound like local Norwegian folklore. That sounds like Dante's Inferno or
Yeah,
something from European literature.
that is the fascinating piece of detective work in our sources. It turns out there was another woman imprisoned in the fortress at the exact same time, a woman named Anne Rhodius.
Who was she?
She was not a local, not by a long shot. She was the sophisticated wife of an exiled astrologer. She was educated. She was from the South. She was literate. And she was apparently very, very bored. She was a high-status prisoner, basically under house arrest in the fortress.
So she's there in the prison at the same time as these accused local women and children.
And she starts coaching them. She starts telling them stories about demonology that she's read in books from Europe. She tells them about red violins and specific descriptions of the devil and the geography of hell.
She gave them the script?
She taught them the vocabulary of confession. So when little Marion stood up in court and talked about the boiling water in the horn, she was repeating what Anne Rhodius had told her. And the judges, who were also educated men familiar with these same European theories, heard exactly what they wanted to hear. It validated all of their beliefs.
It's a tragic, deadly game of telephone.
It is. But the ultimate tragedy of Marion isn't just her confession, it's what they made her do next.
They asked for names.
They always ask for names. Who else was there, Marion? Who else did you see at the Devil's Ball? And Marion, terrified, probably thinking it was the only way to save herself, gave them 5 names.
Oh, no.
5 women she knew, friends of her mother.
And what happened to those 5 women?
They were arrested, tried, and burned on March 20, 1663, based on the testimony of a coached 12-year-old child.
And Marion, what happened to her? Did they burn her too?
No. Her sentence was commuted. She was sentenced to a workhouse, and she lived the rest of her life in Vardø.
That is, I can't even imagine. Living in that same village, growing up, walking past the houses of the women you sent to the stake, seeing their children, their husbands.
It's an unimaginable burden to carry. And she wasn't the only victim of that 1663 frenzy. There were others with confessions that were just as surreal.
Right, like Margaret John, the story about the shoe.
Yes. Margaret John confessed to dancing with Satan at a witch's Sabbath. She said that during the dance, she lost her shoe. And Satan, being a gentleman apparently, gave her a new one.
A woman was tortured and burned to death because of a story about a lost shoe.
And Ingeborg, the wife of Peter Krogh, she was one of the few who tried to deny it, who held on to her innocence.
What happened to her?
They subjected her to the water test. She floated again, the physics working against her. They took that as proof of guilt and tortured her relentlessly. She was tortured to death during the interrogation. She died in the torture chamber, and then they burned her body anyway.
It's just relentless. It feels like once the machine started, it just couldn't be stopped.
It couldn't. It had its own momentum. But there's another crucial layer to all of this, one that makes the us versus them dynamic even clearer. We absolutely need to talk about the Sami people.
Yes, this is a crucial part of the deep dive that often gets overlooked in the general histories of witch trials. The Samis are the indigenous people of that region, of northern Scandinavia.
They had lived there for thousands of years. They had a distinct language, a distinct culture, and very distinct spiritual traditions.
And they had their own religion, which wasn't Christianity.
Shamanism. They used sacred drums, they had healers, they communed with nature. To the European officials, these very strict Orthodox Lutherans, this wasn't just a different culture. It was Satanism.
So they viewed the Sami drum as a tool of the devil.
Explicitly. They called it the Runebom. Possession of one was considered a capital crime. And when you analyze the statistics of the Finnmark trials, a very disturbing and very clear pattern emerges.
What's the pattern?
Among the Norwegians who were accused, the victims were almost exclusively women. It fits that traditional European witch profile. But among the Samis who were accused, the victims were almost exclusively men. In fact, all the men executed in the Finnmark trials were Sami.
All of them. That's a staggering statistic. That can't be a coincidence.
It's not. It reveals that this wasn't just about superstition. This was a colonial project dressed in religious clothing.
They were using the witch trials as a tool to crush an indigenous culture.
Exactly. In Sami culture, the men were typically the shamans, the spiritual leaders, the noedi. So by targeting the men, the Danish-Norwegian state was systematically targeting the spiritual and cultural leaders of the Sami people. They were criminalizing their entire culture. Being Sami and practicing traditional spirituality was treated as direct evidence of a pact with the devil. It was a brutal way to impose state control over the native population and force assimilation.
So you have this gender war being waged against the Norwegian women and a colonial war being waged against the Sami, all happening at the same time, all wrapped up in this hysteria.
It was a multi-front war on the other. Anyone who didn't fit the mold of the obedient Christian Norwegian subject was at risk.
How did it ever end? I mean, 70 years is such a long time for this level of intensity, but it did eventually stop.
It stopped largely because of one man, a man named Dandre Peterson Shunnable.
A hero in a judge's robe.
He really was. He was a judge who was assigned to hear appeals in the region in the latter part of the 17th century. And unlike the officials before him, he actually looked at the evidence with a critical, rational eye. He saw the circular logic we talked about earlier.
The logic being, torture leads to confession. Confession leads to more names. Those names lead to more arrests and more torture.
Right. He realized that if you torture anyone long enough and hard enough, they will admit to literally anything to make the pain stop. He recognized that the water test was scientific nonsense. And he started doing something radical. He started refusing to confirm the death sentences.
That must have been incredibly dangerous for him, personally and professionally.
Extremely. He was standing directly against public opinion. The villagers believed these witches were summoning storms and killing them. By letting the accused go, the villagers thought Shunnable was actively endangering the entire community. They hated him for it. He was risking his career and very possibly his life.
But he stuck to his guns.
He did. And his skepticism started to ripple upwards. And then, in 1687, the law changed. A new royal decree was passed that required all death sentences for witchcraft to be reviewed and confirmed by the parliament in Copenhagen.
So bureaucracy finally saves the day.
In a strange way, yes. The delay killed the momentum of the panic. You can't have a local frenzy if you have to wait 6 months for a letter to come back from the capital. The panic couldn't survive the paperwork.
And the last execution in Norway was in 1695.
1695. And then just silence.
This brings us to the memory of it all, or really the lack of memory, because for a very long time, nobody talked about this.
The great forgetting. For nearly 300 years, it just sort of disappeared from the collective conversation in the region.
Why? Was it shame?
Shame is a huge part of it.
Yeah.
You have to remember, the descendants of the accusers and the descendants of the victims were still living together in this tiny, isolated town.
That's incredibly awkward, to say the very least. Hey, your great-great-grandmother was the one who testified that my great-great-grandmother danced with the devil.
Exactly. It was just easier for everyone to bury it, to pretend it didn't happen and move on. And then there was a second, more modern trauma that helped bury it even deeper.
World War II.
1944. The retreating German army used a scorched earth policy across Finnmark to halt the advancing Soviets. They burned Vardø to the ground. Everything. The fortress, the church, the homes, the docks.
So the physical history, the actual buildings, the records, the execution grounds, a lot of it was literally destroyed or buried.
It was. The newer horror of the Nazis overwrote the older horror of the witch trials. When people in Vardø thought of burning, they thought of 1944, not 1663. The trials became a footnote to a more recent and raw memory.
But silence doesn't last forever. In 2011, they finally, formally broke it.
With the Steilneset Memorial.
Yeah.
It was unveiled by Queen Sonja of Norway. And it is, by all accounts, an absolute masterpiece of art and architecture. It forces the memory back into the light.
It's two separate structures, right? Designed by two different people.
Yes. The first part is by Peter Zumthor, the renowned Swiss architect. It's a long wooden cocoon, 125 meters long, suspended on this wooden frame. It looked almost like the fish drying racks, and it actually sways in the wind.
That sounds unsettling.
It's meant to be. Inside, it's a long, dark corridor. And along the walls, there are those 91 windows we talked about at the very beginning.
One for each victim.
One for each victim. And next to each dimly lit window is a plaque with their story. They went back to the court records and found the details. Not just burned as a witch, but the specific, tragic accusation. Accused of tying knots in a rope, confessed under torture that she turned milk sour. It turns the statistic of 91 back into individual human beings.
And the second structure?
That's by the artist Louise Bourgeois. It's a stark, black glass box. Inside that box, there is a single metal chair with a flame burning up through the seat. And the box is lined with mirrors.
So the fire is reflected infinitely?
Infinitely. And when you look into the mirrors, you see your own reflection surrounded by the fire. The viewer becomes the one on trial, the one burning.
Wow. That is an incredibly powerful concept.
It forces you to confront the reality of it. It's not just a story from the past, it was people. And it forces you to ask that deeply uncomfortable question. Where would I have stood in that village, in that time? Would I have been the victim, or would I have been one of the accusers?
You know, we've covered so much ground here. The storm, the law, the torture, the Sammy connection, the forgetting, the remembering. But when we step back from it all, what is the big takeaway? Why does this story from a remote village 400 years ago matter to someone listening today?
I think it matters because the mechanism is timeless. The source material puts it perfectly. Grief leads to blame, and blame leads to punishment.
It's a universal human pattern.
It is. When we are afraid, when something terrible happens that we can't explain, a pandemic, an economic collapse, a sudden tragedy, we instinctively look for a witch. We look for a scapegoat. It might not be an old woman with a cat anymore. It might be an immigrant, a political opponent, a minority group, anyone we can label as other.
We want to restore that sense of control we talked about. We want to feel like we can fix the problem by punishing someone.
Precisely. And Vardø is a warning. It is a perfect, chilling case study of what happens when we let fear dictate our system of justice. When we decide that someone must be to blame, we open the door to atrocities.
It's about the cold, isn't it? Not just the Arctic weather, but the chill of what human beings are capable of doing to each other when they're scared.
That's the line from the research that stuck with me the most. The chill of what humans do when afraid.
I keep thinking about Marion Oliter, that 12-year-old girl who survived. She lived her whole life in that village. She saw the sun not rise for 2 months every single year, saw those storms come in off the Barents Sea, and she carried that memory with her to her grave.
She is the symbol of survival, but also of the scars that never ever go away.
So here's our final thought for you, the listener. The next time you feel that surge of fear or anger, when something goes wrong in the world or in your life, and you desperately want to find someone to blame for it, remember Vardø. Remember those 91 lights burning in the Arctic darkness?
And remember that sometimes storms are just storms. There isn't always a villain. And trying to invent one usually just creates more victims.
It's a heavy lesson from a small village at the edge of the world, but a necessary one. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time. Stay curious and stay warm.